President Trump has been very clear and consistent. He is prepared to use every element of American power to stop drugs from flooding into our country and to bring those responsible to justice. At 20:30 local time, a massive shape slid out of the Caribbean darkness and into history. With its deck lights blacked out and its radar emissions held low, the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group moved south of Puerto Rico like a silent wall of steel, holding more than 18 knots, as if nothing in the region could touch it. To anyone watching from a distance, it looked like another quiet transit. In reality, it was the largest U.S. naval presence in Latin American waters since the late Cold War. Along the Venezuelan coast, that silhouette hit old sensors like a shock. Coastal stations chained to aging radar systems picked up a single oversized return roughly 90 nautical miles north of La Guaira. The picture was wrong from the start. Instead of reading the signature as a full carrier strike group, the system compressed it into one lone destroyer. Within minutes, armed patrol boats were gunning out of port in a hard intercept pattern, driving straight for the plotted track of what they thought was an isolated U.S. warship. This was not curiosity. It was pressure by design, aimed at forcing an American ship to yield space in international waters fully protected under freedom of navigation rules. But the decision to close in on a U.S. carrier group at night based on a bad radar picture was more than a gamble. It was a serious miscalculation. Venezuela believed it was confronting one ship. In reality, it was steering toward the most advanced naval formation afloat. They had picked the wrong opponent. If you are ready to walk through this high-stakes naval face-off step by step, hit subscribe to Military Power, because the next few minutes will show how fast a local gamble can turn into a global warning. The first sign that the night was changing did not come from the sea. It came from the geometry forming on U.S. radar screens, minutes after the Ford strike group settled into its southbound lane. 6 small echoes appeared on the northeastern edge of the display. At first, they looked like routine coastal traffic, harmless and distant. Then their movement shifted. Instead of tracing the wide, lazy arcs typical of local patrols, the contacts tightened. Their tracks bent inward. Soon, the operators watching the scopes saw something unmistakable. The beginning of a formation. From above, the pattern sharpened into an arrowhead. One lead boat held the center line. 2 pairs flanked it at increasing intervals. All 6 were sprinting at more than 30 to 35 knots, pushing long white wakes behind them. Straight, aggressive, converging. They were not shadowing. They were not observing. They were driving toward a specific point on the Ford's projected track. Inside Venezuela's coastal command, the mistake had already taken shape. The aging JY-11B radar, known across the region for poor target discrimination at long range, had compressed the massive return from an entire U.S. carrier strike group into what looked like a single surface combatant. Believing they were dealing with only one ship, not a full formation, local commanders launched 6 fast patrol craft with the confidence of a plan built on wrong information. Their goal was simple: pressure the destroyer, force a visible reaction, and turn the encounter into a political win. On the bridge of the USS Gerald R. Ford, nothing outwardly changed. Red lighting glowed across the consoles. Sailors continued their routines, but beneath the calm, tactical awareness shifted. The symbols on the radar grew brighter as the Venezuelan craft crossed the 20 nautical mile mark, one of the psychological thresholds for a vessel the size of the Ford. Beyond this point, a 100,000-ton carrier cannot turn sharply or accelerate in time to create real distance. Every adjustment becomes slow. obvious and dangerous. Inside 15 nautical miles, the picture hardened. The collision alarm stayed silent, but the digital plots told a different truth. The patrol boats were not steering around the strike group. They were driving into its path. Their angle was too deliberate, their spacing too tight, their line too exact. This was not a drift. It was not a misunderstanding. It was attack geometry. Escort destroyers sharpened their sensors, tracking each wake with increasing detail, while U.S. radar operators added constant updates to the tactical plot. The Venezuelan formation held its arrowhead shape, shifting only by fractions to preserve the perfect intercept line. Any hesitation, any widening of the track would have signaled caution, but the line stayed rigid, which meant only one thing. They were willing to escalate until the U.S. formation flinched. Up on the Ford's flight deck, the wind carried the low vibration of equipment being secured. Deck crews clipped tie-downs, checked cables, locked gear. They moved calmly and professionally, but every action reflected the truth. 6 fast boats approaching at night with coordinated spacing is not a casual visit. The danger is not their size, it is their speed, their angles, their refusal to break formation. Out on the water, the gap shrank mile by mile. What started as faint dots on radar now resembled a tightening pincer aimed directly at the Ford's bow. The geometry left the carrier strike group with only 2 real options: maintain course with absolute resolve, or alter direction and risk sending the worst possible signal. Hesitation in international waters where the U.S. Navy cannot afford to hesitate. So now picture yourself on that bridge, 6 fast craft slicing toward your formation under the cover of darkness, holding a perfect intercept angle, daring you to be the first to move. Would you hold the course, or would you turn the moment the Venezuelan formation crossed the 15 nautical mile line? The entire balance flipped. Up to that point, the Ford strike group had been cruising with predictable rhythm, letting its escorts float in routine spacing around the carrier. Once the fast boats tightened into a hard arrowhead and pushed past 35 knots, the U.S. response shifted instantly from watching to controlling. The first move came from the USS Thomas Hudner, positioned on the Ford's forward quarter. The destroyer pushed its turbines, tilted its bow, and began sliding into a new trajectory. Smooth, cold, and unmistakably deliberate. It cut across the Venezuelan intercept line with a kind of precision you only see from a ship that knows exactly how this game is played. This was a textbook soft block. No aggression, no provocation, yet absolutely firm. The message was clear. The Hudner was taking the geometry before the patrol boats could weaponize it. Out on open water, speed does not win confrontations. Position does. A fast boat can outrun a destroyer, but it cannot outmaneuver one. By planting itself on the center line between the incoming formation and the carrier, the Hudner forced the Venezuelan boats into a narrow tactical corridor. If they broke through, they would reveal intent. If they turned away, their whole pressure play would collapse. Above this tightening geometry, the air ripped with rotor wash as 2 MH-60R Seahawks lifted into the night. Their blades carved ripples across the flight deck before they climbed into Overwatch orbit, forming a glowing ring around the carrier. From their vantage point, infrared sensors caught every movement of the Venezuelan boats, speed spikes, bearing changes, wake patterns, even formation discipline. All of it streamed directly into the Combat Information Center. The helicopters were not there to threaten. They were there to make one thing impossible to ignore: Nothing approaching the strike group would go unseen. But if the U.S. posture was calm, Venezuela's approach was the opposite. The arrowhead tightened again, each fast boat adjusted by mere fractions of a degree, preserving the exact angle needed to pressure the Hudner's screen. The lead vessel pushed toward 40 knots, slicing a razor-thin wake through the black water. They did not widen. They did not drift. They did not hesitate. From the destroyer's bridge, that refusal said everything. They were not just showing the flag. They were executing a deliberate proximity-based challenge. Inside the Hudner, the watch teams tracked the geometry as it evolved. Their soft block had bought control of the water, but it had also raised the stakes. By holding that position, the destroyer was announcing loudly and silently that the carrier's course was non-negotiable. The next move now belonged entirely to the Venezuelan boats. The tension deepened as the Seahawks transmitted sharper detail. The Venezuelan formation held firm, rigid, and fast, carving the sea with the determination of a force convinced it was chasing a single destroyer, not an entire carrier strike group. That mistaken radar picture meant they were pressing far harder than they ever would have otherwise. Now, less than 10 nautical miles out, the boats still had not slowed. This was no longer about distance. It was about will. As the Venezuelan fast boats kept pressing toward the strike group, the atmosphere inside the American formation shifted from quiet geometry to a sharper form of readiness. The kind that does not escalate the moment, but makes it unmistakably clear that escalation is possible. The USS Thomas Hudner remained locked in its soft block position, yet the narrowing distance created a layer of tension that demanded something more visible than maneuvering alone. That signal came from the Mark 45 gun. The turret did not snap or swivel aggressively. Instead, it rotated in a slow, deliberate arc that settled just a few degrees toward the incoming wakes. A movement subtle enough to avoid provocation, yet obvious enough for any trained observer to understand. It was not a warning shot, but it was a message. And in naval confrontations, that message often carries more weight than the round itself. Moments later, the Phalanx CIWS shifted from dormancy into passive tracking. Its white dome did not whirl in a panic. It made short, economical sweeps that fed a constant stream of high-definition data into the Hudner's combat system. To anyone watching from the fast boats, the weapon looked calm, almost idle, although every rotation meant the destroyer could respond in seconds if the encounter crossed the line. Above the formation, the two MH-60R Seahawks tightened their orbit, their infrared pods cutting through the dark water like spotlights that never blinked. They were not circling to intimidate. They were establishing a perimeter of awareness, making it clear that nothing approaching the carrier would go unseen or unrecorded, no matter how small or fast it moved. Meanwhile, the SPY-6 radar shifted into its low-emission listening stance, the mode the Navy uses when it wants precision without the aggressive signature of a full broadcast. It read the Venezuelan wakes, engine surges, and bearing shifts with clinical clarity, building a three-dimensional picture of vessels that showed no sign of slowing or widening their formation. By then, the geometry had tightened into a high-pressure cone, and the lead Venezuelan craft surged forward with a burst of acceleration that told its own story. The wake sharpened, the bow rose, and the water beneath it fractured into spray, small signs to the eye, but enormous signals on the sensors. At roughly 1,000 yards, the decisive moment arrived. A fire control radar pulse lit up the Hudner's forward section, Not long enough to trigger alarms, but unmistakable to anyone who has ever worked a naval watch. It was the technical equivalent of placing a finger on a trigger without pulling it. Non-lethal, but dangerously intimate. Even with that unmistakable lock, the American posture did not change. The gun stayed angled, not aimed. The CIWS stayed passive, not aggressive. The Seahawks stayed overhead, steady and disciplined. And the carrier continued on its original heading, unmoved by pressure from smaller, faster craft. What unfolded in those moments was not intimidation and was not fear. It was control, precise, measured, and absolute. Every weapon, every sensor, every orbit and bearing aligned to a single purpose: prevent escalation without provoking it, even as the Venezuelan boats refused to break momentum. And still, they kept coming. As the distance between the two formations continued to shrink, the confrontation moved off the surface of the water and into the radio spectrum, where communication becomes its own weapon, and where silence can carry more weight than any shouted warning. When the Venezuelan fast boats crossed inside the 5 nautical mile band, the U.S. strike group triggered the next phase of its posture, broadcasting a formal freedom of navigation message across the international hailing channel. A calm, precise declaration that the American formation was operating lawfully in international waters, following a designated corridor, and had no intention of altering course or speed. It was a standard statement in moments like this, yet its timing gave it gravity. The message not only established a clean legal record for any future diplomatic review, it also placed the responsibility for avoiding escalation squarely on the Venezuelan craft. Then came the part that told U.S. commanders more than any transmission could have. The channel remained empty. No acknowledgement, no challenge, no explanation, just silence. Dense, intentional, and unmistakably deliberate. Silence at sea rarely means indecision. More often, it signals resolve. The Venezuelan boats held their arrowhead geometry without a hint of hesitation, their wakes slicing straight lines through the dark water as if the broadcast had never existed. That refusal to answer said more about their intent than any radio message ever could. They were not seeking clarification. They were not requesting space. They were pushing the moment further into a zone where miscalculation becomes as dangerous as malice. For the U.S. Navy, the implications extended far beyond this narrow stretch of water. A carrier strike group represents national authority, and any course deviation under pressure, even a turn of a single degree, could later be portrayed as a concession. That is why the Ford Group held its heading with absolute precision. Understanding that posture, not volume, defines resolve at sea, and that a steady course carries more political weight than any shouted instruction over an open frequency. Meanwhile, the combat information centers aboard the escorts focused less on the empty radio channel and more on the cold data flowing through acoustic sensors and electronic analysis suites. Those readings revealed engine signatures that stayed firmly above 20 knots, occasionally spiking as the Venezuelan boats tightened their formation. The pattern made it painfully clear that the craft were maintaining combat-ready speed and showed no signs of drifting, slowing, or reconsidering their approach. Each minute thickened the atmosphere. The Caribbean stayed deceptively calm on the surface, but beneath that calm lived a layered standoff, tactical in the water, analytical in the sensors, and psychological on the radio waves, where both sides knew that even the smallest deviation could tilt the entire encounter. Through it all, the U.S. formation held its geometry with a discipline that felt almost ceremonial. No ship adjusted course, no aircraft changed altitude, no additional broadcasts were sent. By the time the Venezuelan formation pushed deeper into the inner band, one reality had taken shape with absolute clarity. This encounter was no longer driven by radar misreads or navigational error. It had evolved into a pure contest of will fought in silence across open water, with every mile closing the gap between intention and consequence. As the Venezuelan patrol boats pushed deeper into the inner band, the geometry of the encounter locked into its most dangerous configuration, with both formations appearing on radar and infrared feeds like two parallel walls of steel, advancing toward the same sliver of water, neither side willing to yield a single inch. The Ford Strike Group held its steady 20-knot march, remaining exactly on the heading declared in its earlier broadcast, while the Venezuelan Arrowhead, still compressed and tense, maintained speeds in the high 20s, as if momentum alone might shift the balance of the night. The tension truly sharpened when the range collapsed into what sailors refer to as the gray zone, a space so tight that reactions must be instantaneous, yet so unforgiving that even a small miscalculation can trigger consequences no commander intends. At roughly 1,000 yards, every margin disappears. Ships can no longer shift course without signaling weakness, and fast boats cannot alter direction without revealing their intentions. Every wake, engine pitch, and microdrift becomes part of a silent negotiation in which the smallest movement carries oversized meaning. Even inside that volatile band, the U.S. formation held itself still with a level of discipline that felt almost defiant. There were no course corrections, no extra radio calls, no power changes, only the Thomas Hudner remaining welded to its blocking position, shielding the carrier while keeping its weapons in passive tracking. Through that stillness, the Americans projected something stronger than force: the confidence to hold a line, even when the distance had collapsed into seconds rather than minutes. Inside the combat information centers, analysts watched as data painted an increasingly vivid picture of the Venezuelan state of mind. Their engines stayed at high thrust. Their wakes remained tight and narrow. Their bearing lines showed no drift. Yet subtle cracks began to appear inside the once rigid arrowhead. Bow angles wavered by fractions of a degree, almost invisible to the human eye, yet unmistakable to the Seahawk sensors orbiting overhead. The boat's wakes widened just enough to betray a growing hesitation inside a formation that had until then held its geometry like a spear point. On the American ships, the atmosphere grew even more focused. Sailors kept moving through their routines with controlled efficiency, fully aware that they stood in the space where misjudgment and escalation can become indistinguishable. Operators monitored their scopes for any sign that the Venezuelan boats might either force a breakthrough attempt or peel away in retreat, because both outcomes were now equally possible. Then, with no warning except the numbers on the consoles, the moment of decision became visible. The speed signatures of the Venezuelan boats, solidly above 30 knots for most of the approach, began to fall, first to the mid-20s, then to the low 20s, and finally settling near 18 knots. From above, the Seahawks recorded the transition with clinical clarity. Wakes shortened, bow waves diminished. The once compressed formation began to relax outward. It was not tactical maneuvering. It was a force stepping back from the edge. In perfect contrast, the U.S. formation did nothing. The Hudner held its screen. The carrier maintained speed. The radios stayed silent. Every ship remained locked on its original heading, preserving the same geometry that had defined the standoff from the beginning. The Venezuelan patrol craft had driven themselves to the brink, but the gray zone, unforgiving and unavoidable, forced the decision they had hoped to avoid. When the moment finally broke, the truth was unmistakable. Venezuela blinked. Washington did not. As the Venezuelan patrol boats bled down to roughly 18 knots, the once sharp arrowhead they had carried across the water finally began to collapse. The rigid angles softening into wider arcs that drifted outward as if the formation itself had lost the will to hold its blade-like posture. From the air, the Seahawks captured every subtle movement, each boat turning only a few degrees toward the coastline. Slow enough to mimic routine patrolling, yet precise enough to reveal a deliberate step back from the confrontation they had pushed to the edge. The American formation, in stark contrast, did not shift so much as a fraction of a degree. The USS Gerald R. Ford held its 20-knot advance as if nothing had happened at all, and the USS Thomas Hudner remained welded to the front of the screen, projecting control through a stillness so absolute that it carried more authority than any radio transmission could have offered. Inside the combat centers, operators watched the Venezuelan spacing widen, the tight geometry unraveling until the pattern resembled ordinary coastal movement, rather than an intercept meant to pressure a U.S. warship in international waters. No American voice broke the radio silence, no acknowledgement was issued, no change in formation signaled relief. The U.S. strategy from the beginning had been built on discipline, and that same discipline defined the end. The geometry alone told the story, and the geometry now showed only one thing. The standoff was finished. Above them, the Seahawks continued their unbroken orbit, documenting the retreat with the same calm precision they had used to record the advance, while the SPY-6 and shipboard sensors tracked the withdrawing wakes to ensure that the pullback was real, steady, and not a feint, hiding a sudden attempt to sprint back into the gray zone. By the time the patrol boats settled onto a heading that pointed directly toward Venezuelan waters, the confrontation had fully dissolved. No collision, no warning shots, not even a raised voice over the radio spectrum. The American formation continued exactly as it had before the intercept ever began, untouched and unaltered, while a quieter question lingered among those watching from the bridge and flight deck. If a single radar misread had driven the Venezuelan boats this far into danger tonight, how far might the next misunderstanding push them? And what happens when the margin for error is even smaller? In the end, this clash in the Caribbean came to a close without a single round fired, even though Venezuelan patrol craft tried to block the path of a U.S. carrier, locked fire control radar onto an American destroyer, and drove themselves deep into the gray zone where mistakes can turn into headlines. Through it all, the Ford Strike Group never shifted a degree off course. Its weapons turned silently, its sensors stayed focused, its discipline carried the weight that missiles never needed to deliver. The only vessels that bent were the fast boats themselves, slowing first, widening their spacing next, and finally slipping back toward home waters, while the carrier group continued exactly where it had intended to go from the start. This encounter revealed something that raw firepower alone cannot demonstrate: that American strength at sea lives in presence, composure, and the ability to manage danger without letting it dictate the outcome. And if you imagine yourself standing on that bridge, watching 6 fast boats carve toward your formation in the dark, you have to ask, would you have held the line the way the U.S. Navy did? If this standoff kept you on edge, make sure you subscribe to Military Power, because the next silent encounter on open water may shape the future of global shipping lanes, and you will not want to miss how it unfolds. See you next time.